Welcome to this audio edition of New Scientist from the 5th of November 2022. In this week's cover story, we hear how technological advances are providing fresh insights into Tutankhamun's tomb. Cosmologist Laura Mersini-Horton shares her conviction that our cosmos is part of a multiverse in this week's interview, and we look at which foods really strengthen your immune system. We also bring you science news from across the globe, your favorite science columnists, plus our weird weekly roundup in feedback. New Scientist is read to you by Marnie Chesterton, Quentin Cooper, and me, Robbie Stevens.
Found. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was a revelation, but 100 years later, new scientific methods are painting an even richer picture of the ancient Egyptians. It is one of those strange quirks of history that Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's tomb exactly 100 years after Jean-François Champollion cracked ancient Egypt's hieroglyphics. Champollion's breakthrough in 1822 unlocked the civilization's rich written archive, while Carter's discovery in 1922 offered an unadulterated view of pharaonic opulence. It's unlikely that 2022 will be remembered as a pivotal year in Egyptology, but that doesn't mean the field is stuck in a rut. Archaeologists now have the tools of modern science at their fingertips. Their discoveries may seem relatively humdrum at first glance, but they could prove transformative for our understanding of ancient Egypt. A look back at the breakthroughs of 1822 and 1922 shows us why. One of the most famous ancient Egyptian texts we could read once we understood hieroglyphics was the Book of the Dead, and Tutankhamun's treasures showed us a grand pharaonic tomb in vivid detail. Throw in Egypt's mummies and the world's most iconic tombs, the pyramids, and it's easy to assume the ancient Egyptians were fixated on death. Today's archaeologists tend to focus on the day-to-day of ancient Egyptians' lives. Doing so provides a more down-to-earth perspective, making them seem more like us. We can now gain insights into the way skilled artists worked millennia ago, for instance, and even reconstruct the sights and smells of the landscapes they occupied, bringing us closer than ever to experiencing ancient Egypt. This isn't to say archaeologists have turned their backs on the pharaohs. Some are convinced that an untouched royal tomb even grander than Tutankhamun's still awaits discovery. If the tomb of Queen Nefertiti is ever found, researchers will surely have another year as important as 1822 and 1922 to celebrate. Until then, by putting the lives of ordinary ancient Egyptians in the spotlight, Egyptology has made sure it remains relevant to a 21st century audience.
News this week. Brazil election. Lula win hailed as victory for the Amazon. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who campaigned to protect the rainforest, narrowly beat Jair Bolsonaro in the Brazilian presidential election. Defenders of the Amazon rainforest were overwhelmed with relief on the 30th of October as Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva narrowly secured Brazil's presidency. Lula, who was president from 2003 to 2010, beat incumbent Jair Bolsonaro by just 1.8% of votes in the divisive presidential election. The tight victory could save the Amazon just as it's reached a crucial tipping point, say Brazilian environmentalists. During the past 4 years, the Amazon has been threatened, attacked and destroyed as the government openly promoted environmental crimes, says Erica Berenguer at the University of Oxford, who was in tears as she spoke to New Scientist. It was like having to silence a scream inside you every day as you watch the object of your life, your career and passion destroyed. Lula's election is a victory not only for the region, but for humanity and life itself. Deforestation soared to a 15-year high as Bolsonaro publicly promoted the development of the rainforest, diluted environmental regulation and gutted key environmental institutions of funding and expertise. The amount of the Amazon being cleared is now nearly 75% higher than when Bolsonaro took office in 2019, and the 13,000 hectares lost in 2021 was the largest annual figure since 2008. In contrast, Lula has campaigned to protect the rainforest, and deforestation plummeted by 72% between 2004 and 2016 when Lula and his successor Dilma Rousseff were in power. Lula has pledged to remove illegal miners and ranchers clearing the Amazon. Among his more ambitious proposals are the subsidization of sustainable farming, the creation of a ministry dedicated to indigenous peoples, and a national climate change authority that ensures Brazil's policies are in line with its Paris Agreement goals. His administration is expected to set new climate targets after they were rolled back by Bolsonaro, says Nathalie Unterstel, a Brazilian climate change policy expert at the think tank Talanoa. Rebuilding environmental institutions and removing illegal groups from the Amazon will be challenging, particularly with a divided Congress and a narrow electoral mandate, environmental campaigners warn. Stopping the slaughter of indigenous peoples and the devastation of the Amazon will require countering powerful gangs and, very often, the interests of allies and supporters in local governments and the parliament, says Marcio Astrini, Executive Secretary of the Brazilian Climate Observatory, in a statement. A series of bills proposed by Bolsonaro, including the legislation of mining on indigenous land, could also be approved in the 2 months before Lula takes office on the 1st of January. Environmental groups have said that they won't hesitate to call out Lula, who's been criticised for overseeing the construction of a mega dam in the Amazon, for missteps, and that they expect him to do more than simply reverse the damage caused by his predecessor. As the leader of one of the 6th biggest carbon emitters at a time when the effects of climate change are accelerating around the world, Lula needs to ensure that Brazil increases the ambition of its pledges to the Paris Agreement, says Astrini. Humanity has just 84 months to cut emissions to safeguard the 1.5 degrees C target. Brazil is part of both the problem and the solution. Lula's victory should be a boon not just for the Amazon, but also for Brazilian universities, healthcare, and broader science, where Bolsonaro has also cut funding and filled senior posts with unqualified allies. He slashed public funding for science and technology research by almost half, to its lowest level in more than a decade, and accused public research institutions of falsifying data. A 2021 inquiry by the Federal Senate of Brazil concluded that Bolsonaro should be charged with crimes against humanity for allowing COVID-19 to tear through the country, leaving 687,000 Brazilians dead. The narrow margin of Lula's victory added to concerns that Bolsonaro could contest the result. The outspoken president has regularly alleged that voting machines are manipulated without providing evidence. We're content that the elections have been held according to the law and, in spite of some incidents, hope that President-elect Lula will give education and science, as well as health, the environment and culture, the importance they had in his previous government, says Renato Janine Ribeiro, president of the Brazilian Society for the Advancement of Science.
News this week. A soup of Omicron subvariants could drive the next COVID-19 wave. The subvariants BQ1.1 and XBB may somewhat evade prior immunity. However, further research is required. Despite winter approaching in the Northern Hemisphere and mixed vaccine availability worldwide, the number of reported COVID-19 cases and deaths are declining globally. As of the week ending 23rd of October, reported cases were down 15% on the previous 7 days, while deaths declined 13%. Regardless of this dip, a soup of new coronavirus subvariants looks set to drive a wave of infections across continental Europe, the UK, and the US this November, says Christina Pagel at University College London. Many other parts of the world are already experiencing or coming out of these waves. Until recently, the pandemic jumped from one COVID-19 lineage to the next, such as from Delta to Omicron, says Moritz Gerstung at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. He says, typically, a new variant came and displaced all or most other preceding lineages very quickly, But now we're seeing a real mix of subvariants with much more incremental changes that result from them acquiring a portfolio of mutations all over the viral genome. High levels of immunity are creating a selection pressure towards immune-evading variants. Earlier in the pandemic, quick lineage jumps occurred as the virus got better at infecting cells, says Göstung. Now that is optimized, smaller mutations are helping to evade immunity, he says. Perhaps one of the most concerning subvariants is BQ1.1, a descendant of the Omicron BA5 subvariant BQ1. From the 3rd to the 9th of October, BQ1 and its descendants made up 6% of the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus sequences submitted to the GISAID Global Viral Database and had been detected in 65 countries. In France, BQ1.1 already makes up around half of the sequenced cases, probably reaching that point before the rest of Europe, but perhaps not much earlier, says Göstung. BQ1.1 cases roughly double every week, so it quickly becomes widespread, he says. BQ1.1 may also account for most of the COVID-19 infections in Africa, where it was identified in Nigeria in July. However, limited testing makes it hard to know, says Göstung. The subvariant's rapid spread is probably due to 6 mutations that alter the surface of the spike protein it uses to enter cells. Vaccines rely on this protein to bring about an immune response. Early research suggests BQ1.1's mutations enable it to evade neutralizing antibody responses generated by vaccines and prior infections. Göstung says, "We see a fairly decent correlation between the number of mutations in different lineages and their rate of spread. BQ1.1 has among the highest number of immune-evading mutations. BQ1.1's advantage is more likely to be due to its ability to evade immunity than it being better at infecting cells," says Pagel and Göstung. Another Omicron subvariant, XBB, has particularly taken hold in India, where it was first identified and now accounts for up to a third of the country's reported SARS-CoV-2 infections. Out of all the current soup variants, BQ1.1 and XBB look like the ones with potential to beat out the rest, says Pagel. XBB arose from a so-called recombination event, where 2 BA2 descendants infected the same cell and exchanged genetic material, forming a hybrid subvariant with 7 key mutations for evading immunity, more than any other subvariant in circulation. Catching 2 or more subvariants at once may result in a higher risk of severe illness, but the bigger concern is that recombination could drive mutations that may cause new COVID-19 waves, says Pagel. XBB quickly spread from India to Singapore, where, with its descendant XBB1, it drove a wave of infections that peaked around mid-October. It is now travelling through the rest of Asia. From the 3rd to the 9th of October, XBB comprised up to 1.3% of the sequences submitted to GISAID and had been detected in 35 countries. According to the World Health Organization, or WHO, there is early evidence of a higher reinfection risk with XBB compared with other Omicron subvariants among people who caught COVID-19 before Omicron was dominant. It is unclear whether an XBB infection protects against BQ1.1 or vice versa, because they have very different mutations, says Göstung. My personal opinion is an infection with BQ1.1 should provide good immunity against the ancestral forms of the virus, BA2 and BA5, closely related to BQ1.1, but XBB is very different to BQ1.1, so it's hard to say. To date, there is no substantial evidence to suggest that XBB or BQ1.1 cause more severe illness than the original Omicron variant, according to the WHO. And while BQ1.1 is currently more prevalent than XBB, this may not mean the former will outcompete the latter. Göstung says, there is a scenario where they could both become widespread.
News this week. JWST finds ancient galaxy may actually be 2 galaxies merging. The James Webb Space Telescope, or JWST, has cast its eye on one of the oldest known galaxies, formed just 400 million years after the Big Bang, and it might be two galaxies merging. In 2012, the Hubble Space Telescope spotted what appeared to be the oldest galaxy we had found, MAX 0647JD, thanks to the gravity from a cluster of galaxies called MAX 0647 bending and magnifying its light, a phenomenon called gravitational lensing. MAX 0647JD formed about 13.3 billion years ago, or just 400 million years after the Big Bang, although JWST has since found galaxies that are potentially older. Now, Tiger Yu-Yang Shao at Johns Hopkins University in Maryland and his colleagues have captured light from MAX 0647JD using JWST's powerful infrared sensors and found that it appears to be either two galaxies or a galaxy with two distinct clumps of stars, with a third satellite galaxy nearby. Galaxies so far away from us, about 13.3 billion light-years away, are usually too dim to observe. Due to gravitational lensing from the galaxy cluster, the light will bend and magnify MAX 0647JD by 8 times, so it's actually 8 times brighter than it was, says Shao. One of the clumps of stars in MAX 0647JD looks larger and bluer than the other, which indicates that it formed more recently than the redder clump, because the longer it takes light to travel to us, the more its coloration shifts to redder spectral hues. Shao and his team don't have enough data to say whether the galaxies are merging or have formed beside one another, but if confirmed to be a merger, it would be the oldest known example of one. Even if MAX 0647JD is just one galaxy with two distinct clumps, it could provide important information on how the first galaxies formed. It came into being in the so-called reionization era of the universe, just after the first stars began to form. The universe has vastly expanded since these early galaxies formed, so they're all very far away. Although other galaxies have been observed out to these early times, you can count them on one hand, says Simon Dye at the University of Nottingham in the UK. They are rare, and therefore each one gives us valuable insight into galaxy formation in the very early universe. However, we will need a larger sample of such objects across the sky to work out exactly when and how the first galaxies began to form, he adds. Shao and his team hope to learn more about MAX 0647JD with another JWST observation in January next year. On that pass, it will take photos at 2 longer wavelengths of light and gather spectroscopic data for MAX 0647JD, which will allow better estimates of age and composition.
News this week. Large cities lead to more segregation between rich and poor. Smartphone data from more than 9 million people in the US reveals that big cities lead to greater socioeconomic segregation, despite claims they reduce it. People living in large cities are more segregated and mix less with those from different socioeconomic backgrounds than people in small towns, according to an analysis of anonymous phone data from more than 9 million people in the US. A long-standing premise of urban design is that cities encourage interactions between different economic groups and so lead to less segregation. One of the most common ways to measure this segregation is to look at where people live and their corresponding economic status. Measurements like this seem to support the idea of cities enabling mixing, but some argue that this static snapshot is incomplete and needs to include how people move and interact when they aren't at home. Now, Jure Leskovich at Stanford University in California and his colleagues have used smartphone data on 1.6 billion interactions between 9.6 million people in more than 382 US towns and cities to show that the largest cities, in fact, cause more segregation between people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. First, Leskovich and his team looked at where each phone, representing a person, was located at around 2 a.m. when they were likely to be at home sleeping. From this, we infer their income, their socioeconomic status, and then we look during the day as these cell phones move around, how often these cell phones cross paths, says Leskovich. The researchers defined crossing paths as being in a 50 square metre area within a 5-minute period. They also experimented with more and less strict definitions, changing the space and time boundaries, but this did not alter the findings. They found that their interaction-based measure of segregation was 38% lower, averaged across all areas, than a static measure of segregation, indicating that previous studies may have overestimated segregation when only considering home location. But they also found that segregation was 67% higher in the 10 largest cities they looked at than in the smallest, defined as having fewer than 100,000 people. Leskovich thinks that this higher segregation is because cities have such diversity of different places for people to go. This basically allows people to kind of bucket themselves into more fine-grained buckets, he says. The more buckets you have, the more equals to yourself you can find because you slot yourself in the appropriate bucket. Leskovich and his team also found that the least segregated locations in a city were places like museums and shopping centres that people frequently visit, and that their locations were key for the socio-economic groups they attracted. One way of reducing segregation between people of high and low income could be to strategically place these areas between diverse neighbourhoods to act as a bridge between two groups, says Leskovich. What is new and interesting in what they're doing is the use of mobile phone data, says David Manley at the University of Bristol in the UK. That large kind of spatial data set means that they're able to capture the population movements in a way that we haven't been able to do before. However, the data isn't detailed enough to suggest whether people are truly interacting or just being in the same space, says Manley, and different data sets could be needed to get that higher level of detail.
News this week. Genetically modified mosquitoes cut the insect's number by 96%. In a city in Brazil, male mosquitoes were released that expressed a gene that meant their female offspring, which bite and transmit infections, couldn't survive. The release of genetically modified male mosquitoes into a city in Brazil temporarily cut the virus-carrying insects by up to 96%. Although not a permanent fix, periodically releasing such mosquitoes could reduce the burden of infections, including dengue, malaria, and Zika. Kevin Gorman, at the biotechnology firm Oxitec in Abingdon in the UK, and his colleagues are particularly looking to control dengue. Although usually mild, the infection can be fatal. Already widespread in many parts of the world, climate change may allow dengue-carrying mosquitoes to survive and breed in non-endemic regions. Existing control methods include sleeping nets, which not all at-risk people have access to, and insecticides, which mosquitoes can develop resistance against. To create a longer-term solution, the researchers modified males of the mosquito species Aedes aegypti. Across all mosquito species, only females bite. A. aegypti females can spread dengue as well as Zika, chikungunya, and yellow fever. The researchers modified male mosquitoes, which they dubbed OX5034, to express a gene that allows their male offspring to live but prevents female larvae from surviving to adulthood, unless given an antibiotic antidote. From May 2018 to April 2019, OX5034 males were released into 4 densely populated neighborhoods in the city of Indaiatuba in the state of São Paulo. Within 2 of the neighborhoods, 100 modified mosquitoes were released, while the remaining test areas were exposed to 500 of the insects. These releases occurred 3 times a week. Compared with a nearby community that wasn't exposed to any of these mosquitoes, the places where the modified insects were released had an 88% to 96% dip in their mosquito population from November 2018 to April 2019, the insect's peak breeding season. Releasing 500 modified mosquitoes, as opposed to 100, didn't substantially improve insect suppression. How long the engineered gene persisted in the local mosquito population depended on the number of mosquito generations that were produced, rather than the initial number of modified males, says Nathan Rose at Oxitec. Using traps to monitor the mosquitoes, the researchers saw the gene persisted in around half of the surviving male offspring of the modified mosquitoes, but disappeared after about 6 generations, over roughly 6 months. It was exactly what we expected, says Rose. We knew that the gene would continue for a little while, but we expected it to disappear. Oxitec has since launched a box-type device throughout Brazil to release modified male mosquitoes periodically during peak dengue season. The box contains the male mosquito eggs. Adding water causes the eggs to hatch after several weeks. Rose says there are plans to expand the box to dengue endemic areas elsewhere, such as in Africa and Southeast Asia. The study didn't look at whether suppressing the mosquitoes led to a lower incidence of dengue. However, similar efforts in Australia, not involving Oxitec, saw fewer cases of locally transmitted dengue compared with previous years. A 2021 study also found a 77% reduction of dengue in Indonesia after modified mosquitoes were introduced. Such mosquitoes have great potential in reducing some infections, but will probably not cut transmission completely, says Zachary Edelman at Texas A&M University. This would probably require a multifaceted approach that also reduces human-mosquito interactions, such as the installation of insect screens on windows and removing standing water where mosquitoes lay eggs. According to Dawn Wesson at the Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine in New Orleans, Louisiana, the effect is a step up from previous insect control strategies, where mosquito sex selection wasn't done via genetic means. She says that's the beauty of this method. You don't have to find all the habitats. You just let the males loose and they find the females, and the gene is passed on. Nathan Rose concludes, dengue aside, Oxitec is working on developing modified mosquitoes to reduce other infections, such as malaria.
News this week. AIs become smarter if you tell them to think step by step. Artificial intelligence models can outperform humans at tasks AIs normally struggle with if they are told to think a certain way, but it doesn't help them grasp sarcasm. Telling artificial intelligence models to think step by step when carrying out a task can improve their performance so much that they can outperform humans at jobs AIs usually struggle with. Using the phrase, "let's think step by step," to cajole AIs into taking more logical decisions was first suggested in a May study presented at a computational neuroscience conference. Such chain-of-thought prompting encourages these models, which include GPT-3, a text-generated AI developed by OpenAI, to logically consider tasks in the same way humans do. Now, Mirak Suzgun at Stanford University in California and his colleagues at Google Research have put chain-of-thought prompting to the test, asking AI models to tackle 23 tasks that AI historically hasn't been better at than humans. The tasks included sorting a list of words into alphabetical order and imagining where you would end up after following a number of navigational steps. 3 different AI models, Codex, Instruct GPT, and Palm 540 billion, were asked to complete the tasks without any prompting on how to think, and also after being instructed to think step by step. Prompting the models improved their performance by between about 25 and 32% on average across all the tasks. The results were also compared with how well humans performed each task in experimental conditions. Without the chain of thought prompt, The AI models were only better than humans in between 4 and 6 of the 23 tasks, depending on which model was used. With the prompt, the AIs were better than humans in between 10 and 17 of the tasks. Prompting made the AI models perform worse than when unprompted in 3 tasks. One of these measured sarcasm, while the other 2 required prior knowledge, such as common presuppositions about how the world works. The research shows that using chain-of-thought prompting works in several different data sets, domains and settings, says William Wang at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Moving forward, prompt engineering will still be critical for enabling GPT-3 for different tasks, says Wang. He believes that chain-of-thought prompting improves AI performance because it mimics the way that the models are trained by being presented with data sequentially. It's easier to elicit knowledge from large language models this way, he says. He compares it to how people interact. For humans, sometimes I also need students to prompt me in a particular order, so it's easier for me to give them what they need.
Banning solar plants on farmland in England would be a grave error. The construction of solar plants on farmland in England has come under attack, but there are 3 reasons why they shouldn't be banned, says Michael LePage. Michael LePage is an environment reporter at New Scientist.
Are fields of solar panels a blight on England's green and pleasant land? Some figures at the top of the UK government certainly think so. Liz Truss, then UK Prime Minister, said in August, "I think one of the most depressing sights when you're driving through England is seeing fields that should be full of crops or livestock, full of solar panels. Agricultural lands should be used for food production." This is an issue in many other countries too. China, for instance, is reportedly considering a ban on solar on farmland and in forests. In England, existing rules already exclude solar farms on the most productive agricultural land. Nevertheless, the UK government was reportedly planning to effectively ban them on most English farmland. With Rishi Sunak, who has previously criticised solar farms on farmland, now having replaced Truss, it is unclear whether the UK government will pursue this, but opponents of solar on farmland must know 3 things. First, a lot of food is being turned into biofuels, even though food-based biofuels increase greenhouse emissions, harm biodiversity, and push up food prices. Second, plants aren't great at capturing solar energy. Crops typically turn less than 1% of the solar energy that hits them into usable biomass, whereas solar panels convert about 20% of light energy into electricity. Third, farming is very polluting, responsible for 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions as well as many other pollutants. In the UK in 2020, 121,000 hectares were used to grow crops for producing heat, electricity or biofuels rather than food. That is 5 times as much as the 23,000 hectares covered by ground-mounted solar. Golf courses cover 126,000 hectares. To see which is a better use of land, let's compare what we get from solar panels and biofuels. Simon Evans at the climate site Carbon Brief has calculated that per year, a hectare of wheat can produce enough bioethanol for a car to drive around 23,000 kilometres. For sugar beet, it is 53,000 kilometres. A hectare of solar, by contrast, can produce enough electricity in a year for an electric car to drive 2,570,000 kilometres. So a hectare of solar gets you 50 to 110 times further, and with much less pollution along the way. This is why it makes no sense economically or environmentally to ban solar on farms, while continuing to allow farms to grow foods and turn them into biofuels. Why can't solar just go on roofs, you might ask? There are several reasons why farmland is often better, from having solar panels facing the right direction at the right angle to the costs of installation and maintenance. We need to expand renewable capacity as fast as we can, To have any chance of stopping the rise in average global temperature from greatly exceeding 1.5 degrees C, not add yet more obstacles. It is also worth pointing out that the land under solar farms can still be used for some food crops and grazing or managed for wildlife. That said, when it comes to food, our aim should be to do away with conventional farms. It is estimated that producing food directly from solar electricity, food from air, would let us produce as much protein as we currently get from crops on a tenth of the land. This would have huge environmental benefits, like allowing us to reforest vast areas. This year, the UK got a glimpse of the future, when large parts of the country became parched, temperatures exceeded 40 degrees C, or 104 degrees F, and wildfires destroyed homes. It is astounding that some leaders still don't seem to grasp that global warming is a far greater threat than a few solar farms.
Dismissing environmentalists with an anti-growth label is wrong. The idea that environmentalists are part of the Tories' imaginary anti-growth coalition is grotesque. Conserving the environment and economic progress are not mutually incompatible, says Graham Lawton. Graham Lawton is a staff writer at New Scientist and author of Mustn't Grumble, The Surprising Science of Everyday Ailments. You can follow him at Graham Lawton.
Like many people in the UK, I found out last month that I'm a member of a sinister organisation called the Anti-Growth Coalition. Our ex-Prime Minister Liz Truss, who resigned as I was writing this, first used this inane slogan at the Conservative Party conference and trotted it out at every opportunity afterwards. In case you missed it, the coalition includes Remainers, environmentalists, trades union members, protesters and people who live in North London townhouses and appear on the BBC. I tick a lot of those boxes. OK, all of them. I'm also a proud member of our Home Secretary's Guardian-reading, tofu-eating wokerati. You have to hand it to the Conservatives. They've excelled at coming up with pithy, three-word slogans to get their divisive messages across. But under the hapless Truss, even that dubious skill deserted them. Anti-growth coalition is a total dud, like a small child copying the general form of a joke, but not knowing how punchlines work. It's also grotesquely wrong, especially in its smear on environmentalism. A few days after Truss started tossing the slogan about, I watched an online event run by Green Alliance and Natural England. One speaker was Ian Bateman, an environmental economist at the UK's University of Exeter and a former advisor to 7 environment secretaries, including Truss. He poured gallons of high-octane scorn on her flagship idea. The UK is in danger of becoming a looking-glass state where protection of the environment is portrayed as getting in the way of growth, he said. This view is specious, wrong-headed, outdated nonsense, and it's dangerous. The economy is totally and utterly dependent on the environment. Consider the then Energy Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg's insistence that the UK must get every cubic inch of gas out of the North Sea. He then put our money where his mouth is, pledging £90 billion of public money to subsidise fossil fuel exploration on the grounds that it would lower energy bills and is greener than importing gas. This latter claim may be true, but that's besides the point. Extracting yet more gas is climate suicide and is economically illiterate. As Bateman pointed out, it takes an average of 15 years for a fossil fuel project to go from discovery to production, by which time the world will have moved decisively away from fossil fuels and nobody will want to buy the stuff. It will be £90 billion wasted. Not to mention the fact that solar and wind power are already cheaper than gas, and that by investing a fraction of that £90 billion in both, the UK could have a green, cheap and secure energy system in a few years. And yet, another plank of Truss's dash for growth was to ban solar panels on farmland, partly because she prefers to look at Baa lambs when driving through the countryside. She evidently doesn't know that sheep farming is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and isn't viable in the UK without anti-free market government subsidies. Let's hope her successor, Rishi Sunak, takes another tack, as he seems to be doing over the Tory party's threats to tear up plans to pay farmers to become stewards of nature. The Environmental Land Management Scheme, ELM, was designed to replace the EU's agricultural subsidy system, the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP, a move seen by many pro-Europeans like me as the one positive outcome of Brexit. Under ELM, farmers would be paid for environmentally friendly land management instead of being subsidised to produce as much food as possible. The cost to nature be damned. That was how CAP worked, and it was an environmental catastrophe. Truss's wrecking crew reportedly wanted to go back to something similar, on the spurious grounds that ELM is a threat to food security. They're presumably unaware that sheep farming in the UK could be viable without subsidies if the animals were reared in newly restored woodland. Bar humbug. At the online event, Tony Juniper, chair of Natural England, summed it up nicely. Too many people seem blind to the fact that our economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature, with our entire way of life sustained by ecosystems as diverse as soils and the sea. Nature is the basis of our food supply, clean water, air, and vital for human health and well-being. Degrading those key services means money has to be spent dealing with the fallout, money that could be better spent elsewhere. Too many people indeed, and far too many people in positions of power. There is an anti-growth coalition in the UK. It's led by the dinosaurs who think that conserving the environment and economic progress are mutually incompatible.
How technology is revolutionizing our understanding of ancient Egypt. A century on from the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, CT scans, 3D printers, and virtual reality are bringing the world of the pharaohs and ordinary ancient Egyptians into sharper focus, discovers Jo Marchant. Jo Marchant is a journalist based in London. Her latest book is The Human Cosmos, A Secret History of the Stars.
A century ago this month, Howard Carter opened the tomb of the boy king Tutankhamun. Within, he found ornate jewellery, beautiful furniture, fine clothing, and that famous gold face mask. Everything was in keeping with a royal burial from the most prosperous period in ancient Egyptian history. Or almost everything, because hidden within the mummy's bindings, Carter discovered a dagger that seemed out of place. The problem wasn't with its golden sheath, it was with its blade of gleaming iron. A metal the Egyptians didn't learn to smelt until centuries after Tutankhamun's death. Carter had a simple explanation. He assumed the dagger was imported, perhaps from the ancient Hittite Empire in Anatolia, where there was an early iron industry. Not until 2016 was it confirmed that the iron originated from much further afield, with the discovery it contains the high levels of nickel associated with meteoric iron. For the Egyptians who wrapped the dagger close to their king's body, it was a gift from the gods. What makes this finding significant is the way it was made, through an X-ray analysis performed without damaging the dagger. It is indicative of a new approach to Egyptology that emphasizes preservation over destruction. Whether it is studying mummies without unwrapping them or generating virtual landscapes as they existed millennia ago, we can now make discoveries Carter could have barely dreamed about while leaving artifacts intact for future generations. Scanning a mummy is nothing new. X-rays were discovered in 1895, and a few years later, in 1903, Carter carried the 3,300-year-old body of Pharaoh Thutmose IV out of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and took it by horse-drawn cab to a nearby hospital that had access to the new technology. But recent decades have seen significant changes in the way archaeologists use X-rays, partly because it is now much easier for them to obtain access to high-resolution CT scanners, which fire X-rays from multiple angles to construct a three-dimensional image of an object's internal structure. In 2021, Zahi Hawass, a former Minister of Antiquities in Egypt, and Sahar Salim at Cairo University published the digital unwrapping of the mummy of Amenhotep I, a pharaoh who ruled 2 centuries earlier than Tutankhamun, around 1500 BC. The king's tomb was looted in ancient times, but a few generations later, priests salvaged the body and reburied it for safekeeping. It was discovered in the late 19th century, beautifully preserved inside a coffin that also included flower garlands. Pharohs and Salim's CT scan showed that the mummy had been carefully repaired. They also revealed 30 pieces of gold, quartz, and clay jewellery, with forms including a scarab beetle, snail shell, and serpent head, as well as a belt formed of 34 gold beads. When Carter and his team analysed Tutankhamun's mummy in 1925, they pulled it to pieces in order to discover the objects, including the iron dagger that had been placed inside. Now, says Pharohs, we can show you the face, we can show you the gold amulets that we found inside without touching the mummy. Of course, a virtual scan might fail to generate the same sense of awe that can come from directly viewing an ancient object. But many researchers are now going one step further than imaging, using digital scanning data to reconstruct physical objects in exquisite detail with 3D printers. This is sometimes done to engage the public. When Tutankhamun's mummy was deemed too fragile to travel for an international touring exhibition in 2010, for example, the curators printed a realistic copy. Generating replicas of inaccessible body parts can aid scientific study. In 2018, researchers printed out a mummy's heart to understand how it had been treated by its embalmers. And last year, Egyptologists in Manchester in the UK generated 3D printouts of scanned bones to identify the species inside some ancient Egyptian animal mummies. Campbell Price, curator of Egypt and Sudan at the Manchester Museum, has used the technique to recreate more items otherwise hidden from view, such as 4 crocodile skulls bound inside a single mummy. He has even reproduced an embalming plate, used to cover the incision made during the embalming process, revealing a surface decorated with the Eye of Horus, an ancient Egyptian symbol of protection. You would never have seen or been able to handle these things, says Price, but you can with 3D printing. New technology can also transform our perspectives of life in ancient Egypt, says Enrico Ferraris, an Egyptologist and curator of the Egyptian Museum in Turin in Italy. Experts have traditionally focused on texts, he says. Normally they put more emphasis on what is written on an object and not what it is made of. This approach has highlighted Egyptian religious beliefs, eternity, mummies, death, and so on, says Ferraris. He argues that science can now offer a more down-to-earth, human insight into this ancient civilization, such as its manufacturing techniques or how its different artisans worked. Ferraris has been enlisting scientists around the world to use techniques including mass spectrometry and X-ray fluorescence to reinvestigate hundreds of items recovered in 1906 from a 3,400-year-old tomb of a high-ranking foreman, Ka, and his wife Merit, located near Luxor in southern Egypt. The team's analysis of a painted box from the tomb revealed that the artist used 2 different black inks, one to fill in larger areas and one for final touches, such as dots and strokes. Such investigations are key to a new chapter in Egyptology, says Ferraris. What's more, digital approaches are enabling Egyptologists to virtually reconstruct not just tombs and artifacts, but entire landscapes. In a project called Constructing the Sacred, Elaine Sullivan at the University of California, Santa Cruz has combined data from sources including excavations, satellite imagery, and topographic maps to produce a 3D model through time of Saqqara, a sprawling ancient cemetery just south of Cairo. It is the perfect approach to capture the changing nature of the site over Egypt's entire history, says Sullivan. The cemetery developed from a scattering of mud brick tombs at the edge of the desert in the First Dynasty, around 3000 BC, to a huge ritual landscape full of pyramids, temples, and tombs that persisted until Roman times, roughly 2,000 years ago. I don't think anyone really has a brain that is sophisticated enough to put those hundreds of different buildings back together in your mind, she says. The 3D reconstruction enables virtual time travel, she adds, so viewers can experience what the site would have looked like at different moments in history. The model also enables Sullivan to test new ideas, such as sightlines. She argues that a previously underappreciated factor in where people placed their tombs was having an uninterrupted view of monuments that were important to them, such as their pharaoh's pyramid or the Temple of Ptah, an Egyptian deity, at nearby Memphis. She predicts such virtual landscapes will become more realistic as the technology improves. Researchers are already working to reconstruct sounds, smells, and lighting effects, while Sullivan and others are delivering their 3D reconstructions via virtual or augmented reality headsets. A century ago, many of the treasures Carter and his peers uncovered were put inside museum cases. Today's Egyptologists dream of creating virtual worlds where we can walk ancient streets, smell the incense inside grand temples, and shiver inside cold tombs. However, some specialists worry that the science can be pushed too far. Particularly problematic is the imaging and sampling of ancient human remains to look for clues to illnesses or a cause of death. Techniques including X-ray imaging, CT scans, and DNA tests have driven TV documentaries and best-selling books, but many scientists have expressed skepticism over the results. Egyptologists, including Price, are skeptical too. People think it's this magic wand, he says. You wave science and suddenly, bam, you know everything about the mummies. In practice, however, fragile remains that are thousands of years old and have been through the violent process of mummification are much harder to interpret than living people. Price recalls arguments between doctors and archaeologists when the mummies held by the Manchester Museum were CT scanned at a local children's hospital. People couldn't decide what they were seeing, he says. There is also the ethical question of how, or even if, to present the results of scans to the public, when it seems unlikely that the ancient individuals would have been comfortable sharing such information. The hieroglyphics and imagery suggest they wanted to be remembered as godlike, not as imperfect, ill humans. For these reasons, the museum's upcoming Golden Mummies of Egypt exhibition, which explores ancient Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife, will not show any CT scans, he says. We are actively editing out information. Another researcher who emphasizes both the potential and limits of new technology is independent Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves, author of The Complete Tutankhamun. He studied virtual reconstructions of the painted walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber, created using laser scans and digital photographs by art conservation company Factum Arte. It's fantastic, says Reeves. It doesn't matter how high on the wall it is. You can see every brushstroke. You get a better view from sitting down at the desk than you do looking at it face to face. Reeves identified previously unseen cracks in the tomb walls, which suggested to him the presence of hidden doorways. He also concluded that several painted scenes of Tutankhamun's funeral have been altered. He believes they originally showed Tutankhamun in the act of burying an earlier Egyptian royal, Queen Nefertiti. In 2015, Reeves proposed a dramatic hypothesis that beyond Tutankhamun's relatively small 4-room tomb lies at least one more chamber, the resting place of Nefertiti herself. In other words, Carter's astonishing discovery a century ago might not be the final word. There may be another, even richer royal burial to be found. But that doesn't mean Reeves thinks this heavy emphasis on scientific tools is problem-free. Since 2015, several teams have probed the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb with ground-penetrating radar, which uses radar pulses to image buried objects. Detecting chambers cut deep into rock is extremely difficult, however. Researchers were unable to agree on how the data should be interpreted, and without clear confirmation, most scholars have dismissed the Nefertiti idea. Reeves, however, argues that science shouldn't simply trump Egyptology. We automatically assume it's the last word, but you cannot just ignore the archaeological evidence. In September, he reported a further clue from the wall paintings. Some hieroglyphics had been altered in antiquity. Although they now depict Tutankhamun's burial by his successor, they originally identified the boy king himself burying someone else in this very tomb. Reeves thinks his hypothesis could be tested by drilling a small hole in one of the tomb's walls and using a tiny camera to investigate the opening. Although whether this would gain approval from the authorities remains an open question. Despite the controversies, and with the technology improving all the time, some researchers view the data gathered using non-invasive scientific tools as a valuable provision in the event of archaeological finds being damaged. Ultimately, materiality is fragile, argues Pharohs. This means physical remains are always at risk from disasters such as flooding, fire, or looting. We have to do everything to preserve these objects physically, but probably this is not the final goal, says Pharohs. Digital information, once captured, is unbreakable, a sort of insurance that can be studied and appreciated in the future, no matter what happens to the objects themselves, he says. The final goal is the knowledge. Carter, who spent 10 years meticulously recording the items he found in Tutankhamun's tomb, would perhaps agree.
How did Tutankhamun die? Few historical figures have been investigated as exhaustively and brutally as Tutankhamun. The mummy was unwrapped in November 1925 by anatomist Douglas Derry. He removed the charred, crumbling bandages, cut up the body to remove its jewellery, and scraped the pieces from their golden coffin with hot knives. Derry determined that the pharaoh died young, aged around 18. He had a large head, a scab on his left cheek, and no obvious cause of death. That is still about all we can say for sure. In 1968, anatomist Ronald Harrison at the University of Liverpool in the UK X-rayed the mummy for a BBC documentary. He saw a thinning at the base of the skull that might have resulted from a blow to the back of the head, a finding that spawned multiple murder hypotheses, but eventually turned out to be an artifact of the imaging process. In 2005, National Geographic sponsored a team, led by archaeologist and then Secretary-General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities in Egypt, Zahi Hawass, to CT scan Egypt's royal mummies, including Tutankhamun. From the resulting 3D images, the team concluded that the king's left femur was broken and suggested that he fell in a chariot accident. Next, Hawass and his team, now sponsored by rival media company Discovery, attempted to isolate ancient DNA from the bones. In 2010, they reported that Tutankhamun had malaria and that his parents were siblings. They reanalyzed the CT scans, identifying that he had a club foot, and presented a new version of the boy king as sickly, inbred, and infirm. These studies inspired more TV documentaries, but were criticized by other scientists who argued that the DNA results could easily have been due to contamination and that the CT scans couldn't distinguish between injuries or illnesses from before death and damage inflicted since. Not that this has deterred the speculation. More recent ideas include that Tutankhamun had epilepsy or was felled by a hippo.
Six archaeological discoveries to rival Tutankhamun's tomb. From the Terracotta army to the Flores Hobbit, these are the discoveries that experts argue are more significant than the unearthing of Tutankhamun's resting place.
Mycenae grave circle. In the late 19th century, archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann excavated a circle of 6 royal graves at the citadel of Mycenae in southern Greece. He found a hoard of golden treasures from the 16th century BC, including the mask of Agamemnon, which Schliemann believed was worn by Mycenae's mythological ruler who fought in the Trojan War. That is unlikely, but the find revolutionized our comprehension of the Mediterranean, says Jack Davis at the University of Cincinnati in Ohio, revealing the previously unknown Aegean civilizations that preceded historical Greece. Terracotta Army. In 1974, workers digging near the city of Xi'an in China uncovered a life-size clay soldier poised for battle. Archaeologists soon found an entire terracotta army guarding the tomb of the 3rd century BC emperor Qin Shi Huang. Rowan Flad at Harvard University highlights the site along with Yinshu, the last capital of the Shon dynasty. This city, dating to the late 2nd millennium BC, revealed a golden age of early Chinese culture, including palaces, a flood control system, and inscribed oracle bones, the earliest evidence of the Chinese written language. Both were true discoveries of things and stories that had been long forgotten, says Flad. Hand axes of Hoxne. In 1797, antiquary John Frere wrote to colleagues describing sharpened flints uncovered by brickworkers in Hoxne, England. The stones lay 4 meters deep, alongside the bones of enormous, unknown animals, and beneath layers apparently once at the bottom of the sea. Frere suggested they belonged to a very remote period, even beyond that of the present world. His discovery of what we now know are Paleolithic hand axes revealed for the first time the long-term, deep-time human past, says Mike Parker Pearson at University College London, challenging the biblical notion that the world was created in 4004 BC. Uluburun. This Bronze Age shipwreck, found off the coast of Turkey in 1982, stands as one of the great underwater discoveries, says Brendan Foley at Lund University in Sweden. Once described as Wall Street in a ship, it transformed historians' understanding of the era by revealing an astonishing web of trade contacts. The wreck's vast cargo represented at least 11 different cultures, and included weapons, jewelry, ostrich eggs, resin, spices, and copper ingots from as far afield as Egypt, Cyprus, and Asia. The Flores Hobbit. The shock discovery of diminutive humans who once lived on the Indonesian island of Flores was the JFK moment of modern archaeology, says Adam Brum at Griffith University in Australia, in the sense that scientists in the field still remember where they were when they heard the news. The tiny bones, discovered in a cave in 2003, showed that individuals, subsequently dubbed Homo floresiensis, grew to just over 1 meter tall and lived alongside giant lizards. For Brum, it was an electrifying and totally unexpected find.
The cosmologist who claims to have evidence for the multiverse. Cosmologist Laura Massini-Horton says our universe is one of many, and she argues that we've already seen signs of those other universes in the cosmic microwave background, the light left over from the Big Bang. She tells Rowan Hooper about her radical ideas. Rowan Hooper is podcast editor at New Scientist. His latest book is How to Spend $1 Trillion.
How did our universe begin? This is among the most profound questions of all, and you would be forgiven for thinking it is impossible to answer. But Laura Massini-Horton says she has cracked it. A cosmologist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, she was born and raised under communist dictatorship in Albania, where her father was considered ideologically opposed to the regime and exiled. She later won a Fulbright scholarship to study in the US, forging a career in cosmology, in which she has tackled the origins of the universe and made an extraordinary proposal. Massini-Horton's big idea is that the universe in its earliest moments can be understood as a quantum wave function, a mathematical description of a haze of possibilities that gave rise to many diverse universes as well as our own. She has also made predictions about how other universes would leave an imprint upon our own. Those ideas have been controversial, with some physicists arguing that her predictions are invalid. But Massini-Horton argues that they have been confirmed by observations of the radiation left over from the Big Bang, known as the cosmic microwave background. Here she tells New Scientist about her ideas and her life, which she has described in her new book, Before the Big Bang, the origins of our universe in the multiverse. Let's start with your own story of growing up in Albania. To what extent has that shaped your thinking?
It's contributed a lot. I was lucky because I had the kind of parents who spotted early on that I was interested in natural sciences and math, and then nurtured my interest. Another factor that helped a lot was that my mum worked at a non-profit organisation in Albania called the League of Writers and Artists. I got to spend a lot of time with composers, writers and artists, and that opened my horizons to spot early on that there is so much joy in creativity.
You talk in your book about how you think of your life in quantum terms. If you hadn't made a particular decision, then you would be living a different life. Can you elaborate?
In a quantum universe, everything is based on probability. Until you make a measurement on a subatomic particle, all you have are probabilities regarding all possible outcomes. All certainty about the world is gone. Sometimes, during late-night contemplation, I can see parallels between my life in our classical world and the quantum world. I can see how my life resembles a quantum world interwoven with uncertainties and unlikely events. If you think of communist Albania, there was a kind of quantum ambiguity where many bad things could happen at any time for no reason at all, certainly not because of your own doing. There is an analogy with the quantum universe where any outrageous possibility has a non-zero chance to occur.
Getting back to physics, can you explain why our universe is so unlikely and how that led you to think about the multiverse?
It starts with the second law of thermodynamics, which states that the entropy of any system, which roughly means its level of disorder, always increases with time. Therefore, the entropy of our universe at its first moment of existence must have been incredibly small. But the probability of finding a universe that arises spontaneously is directly proportional to its entropy. Since our universe started with a very small entropy, that gives it an exponentially small chance of existing. We know from observations and theory that the universe started as a very small, smooth patch full of energy. And the Oxford mathematician Roger Penrose found that the chance of starting with a universe like that is 1 chance in 10 to the power 10 to the power 123. So there's almost no chance to spontaneously start with a universe like ours. And that number intrigued me because, well, here we are. We can observe the universe around us. This is our home. We know it exists for sure. Yet I can't ask the question, why do we have this universe, if all I am allowed to start with is this universe? I need a pool of possible universes from which I can choose from. So that led me to think that we really need an initial quantum multiverse. That would allow me to meaningfully ask the question of why we got this universe rather than something else.
What do you mean by an initial quantum multiverse?
I mean that in the very first moment before the universe emerged in space-time, you can think of the universe as a wave function in an abstract space of energies. I began thinking about all of this in the early 2000s, around the time that string theory was the leading candidate for a theory of everything that unifies gravity with the 3 other quantum forces to explain our universe. String theory is the idea that nature, at a fundamental level, is 11-dimensional, and particles are actually just the bit we can see of tiny loops of vibrating strings. With string theory, after curling up the extra spatial dimensions to make them sufficiently small to be invisible, you end up with a whole landscape of possible initial energy states or potential Big Bang energies that could start a whole family of different universes. At the time, string theorists thought that this was really bad because they were looking to end up with only one universe, one that looked like ours, described by one theory, and they were ending up with a nearly infinite number of universes. But to me, it was great news because I needed a fundamental theory that would provide that pool of energies that would allow me to ask the question, why did I start with this one rather than something else?
You had your breakthrough in a coffee shop and you wrote QM on the landscape on a napkin, quantum mechanics on the landscape of string theory. Tell us what you meant.
I had realised something that seemed obvious in hindsight. We know for sure that our universe was very small in its first moments of existence. Therefore, it obeys the laws of quantum physics. What dawned on me specifically was that, based on the wave-particle duality of quantum mechanics, I could think of the universe as a wave function instead of as an object. The wave function is the mathematical entity that encodes quantum probabilities. But you can imagine it as a tree made up of many branches, each of which can produce a universe, and it spreads through the energy valleys of the string theory landscape from where it takes its Big Bang energy.
Is this where quantum entanglement comes in? The idea that there can be this subtle quantum connection between the branches?
You get these branches, these many worlds, but you need to decouple them from each other. You need to break that quantum entanglement. Think about when we separate gold from ore. We put the ore mixture into a bath of a compound called borax, and since the borax interacts differently with different minerals, they start separating from each other. In my hypothesis, the string theory landscape was our borax. It broke the entanglement and separated out the many worlds. Somehow, early on, our universe went through a quantum to classical transition. It became a classical object where each event is determined with certainty. This could not have been the case unless the branches of the wave function of the universe completely decoupled. All the branches decouple as they are going through cosmic inflation. This is the phase shortly after the Big Bang, when the universe went through a period of exponential expansion in size. My proposal was that if this decoupling did happen, we would be able to see the remnants of it in the cosmic microwave background, or CMB, the radiation left over from those first moments of our infant universe. The idea was that, as the branches decoupled, traces of the entanglement would have been left behind.
So you made a testable prediction that we should be able to see signs of our universe's primordial entanglement with other universes.
I made a series of predictions with Richard Holman and Tomo Takahashi in 2005 and 2006. We said we would be able to see signatures of this early entanglement. Our present universe is just a rescaled version of its infant self, with all its birthmarks still there. If you think of all these quantum universes as tiny quantum particles, they were all interacting with each other. Gravitationally, they were pulling on each other, and that left scars in our sky. One prediction was the existence of a giant void or cold spot in the CMB. And such a void, about 900 million light-years wide, was found in the observations of the Wilkinson Microwave Anisotropy Probe, a space-based observatory. It was confirmed by the Planck satellite, which also observed the CMB. We were the first to show how you can actually test the multiverse, and that you don't need to go beyond the universe's observational horizon. You can just see it in our sky.
As you probably expected, your ideas proved controversial. For example, there was an analysis of the CMB data in 2016 that didn't support your conclusions. How have you reacted to the criticism?
I did a new analysis to check the status of my theory, using the most recent data from the Planck satellite experiment, with cosmologist Eleonora Di Valentino. The series of predictions we made in 2005 for anomalies in the CMB supports the origin of the universe from a quantum landscape multiverse. There has been a long prejudice against the multiverse. It is an idea that goes back to ancient Hindu and Greek beliefs, but it took a long time to push the idea into mainstream physics. One thing that helped is my proposal to use quantum entanglement as a tool for testing the existence of the multiverse right here, thereby circumventing the speed of light limit constraints. That provided hope that even if we can't see the multiverse directly, we can still indirectly derive evidence and make predictions on where those signatures can be found in our sky.
Max Tegmark at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology has talked of having doppelgangers in other universes when articulating his vision of the multiverse. Would your version of the idea have those?
I don't think there is another Laura out there in some other universe that is my twin or my sister. Once the branches of the wave function have decoupled, they have their own independent existence from each other. So I don't think of having copies of myself in other worlds, and I hope there aren't. If you ask my family, they'd say one eccentric scientist is enough.
The truth about the foods said to boost your immune system. Many foods thought to enhance our natural defenses, such as orange juice and turmeric, don't live up to the hype. Instead, the key to a healthy immune system lies in nurturing your gut microbiome, finds Kamal Nahas. Kamal Nahas has a PhD in pathology from the University of Cambridge and is now at Diamond Light Source in the UK.
It's that time of year again. As the cold and flu season hits the Northern Hemisphere, on top of the ongoing ravages of COVID-19, many of us reach for something to give our body's defences a helping hand. There's no shortage of foods and drinks that claim to be able to help. Supermarket shelves are heaving with immunity support juices, yogurts and spice-infused teas. Comforting, yes, but can these foods really help stave off contagion? The impact of diet on our natural defences is a topic rife with claims that don't stand up to scrutiny. But we're finally developing a clearer picture of the powerful influence that food can have on our immunity. The surprising truth is that focusing on particular products or ingredients could be leading you down the wrong path. In fact, an immune boost might be the last thing you need. Here's a guide to the foods you really should be eating to keep your immune system on top form. The idea that certain foods can help us when we're ill goes back a long way. Think chicken soup or a drink of hot honey and lemon. Many different plants and plant products such as spinach, blueberries, garlic, broccoli, cabbage and turmeric have immune-boosting reputations. In recent years, new concoctions to supposedly help our immune health have been developed at a furious pace. In 2020, nearly 2% of new foods and drinks sold globally made some claim about links to immunity, from breakfast-on-the-go smoothies and probiotic yogurts to fermented drinks such as kefir and kombucha, and so-called functional shots, juices made from ingredients like lime, beetroot and ginger that are designed to impart health benefits. Numerous claims have also been made on social media for the immune-boosting powers of certain foods, especially in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This has prompted the World Health Organization to issue myth-busting alerts that explain how, for instance, hot peppers in food cannot prevent or cure COVID-19. In reality, teasing apart the impact of any food on your immunity is extremely challenging. Many substances that show promise in tests on cells or in lab animals don't measure up in large-scale real-world trials in people. One reason for this is the complexities of the immune system itself, an intricate network of cells, physical barriers, and chemical signals. Our innate immune system is the first to respond to an invader. It includes general-purpose cells such as macrophages and neutrophils that patrol the body, detecting and killing bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites. The next line of protection is the adaptive immune system, with a more specialized set of defenses, such as white blood cells called B cells and T cells, that learn through exposure to recognize and kill specific invaders. Hordes of immune cells rush to the site of an injury or infection, releasing chemicals called cytokines that recruit even more immune cells. A combination of heat, pain, redness and swelling, known as inflammation, builds at the infected site to aid the healing process. It's tempting to think that supercharging this system might allow someone with, say, a cold to spring from their sickbed. But many symptoms of infection are actually signs that your immune system is actively working to fight them off. Inflammation can make your throat sore, for instance, and cytokines might trigger a fever to increase the rate of your immune response. The key to a healthy immune system is to strike a balance between reactivity and restraint. This ensures your body is well equipped to both tackle an infection and to avoid too strong a response. Inflammation is a double-edged sword, says Sung Wook Hong at the University of Minnesota. To limit unnecessary harm, the immune system must put checks in place. Some cytokines inhibit inflammation, and regulatory immune cells keep reactive ones under control. If these checks become disrupted, the immune system can attack the body's own cells and proteins, causing autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes, or multiple sclerosis, or can mistakenly react to harmless foreign substances such as pollen or peanuts, resulting in allergies. But as well as these immune overreactions, there's the increasingly common problem of chronic low-level inflammation, which is linked to accelerated aging and ailments such as stroke and heart disease. So while it's important to maintain a strong immune system to stave off infection, an ability to dampen it is equally important. A crucial component of the immune system is the digestive tract. In fact, the gut is the largest immune organ in the body, and it needs to be. Eating is a perilous process that introduces around 100 grams of foreign proteins from plants and animals per day, as well as a myriad of microbes, all of which must be assessed by the immune system to sift the helpful from the harmful. There are a number of ways that particular foods might be able to support the immune system. The first is via the vitamins and minerals needed for it to function. Vitamins A, C, D, and E, as well as some of the B vitamins, plus zinc, copper, selenium, magnesium, and iron. A deficiency in any of these micronutrients can undermine immune function. And if you read the labels on almost all immunity food products, you will see that this claim is due to the nutrients within them that contribute to the normal function of the immune system, a factor that's been used to market otherwise unhealthy foods such as sugary breakfast cereals. Cynical marketing aside, the question is, if we're consuming the recommended amounts of these nutrients and don't have deficiencies, will extra doses give additional benefits? Many of us reach for vitamin C, either in pill form or from a glass of orange juice, when we feel a cold coming on, fueled by an understanding that it helps our body fight the viruses responsible. Yet many studies show that an extra dose of vitamin C offers no added benefits for someone already eating sufficient quantities, and it's the same story for many of the other nutrients typically added to food products to bolster their immunity status. More promising is vitamin D, which has recently attracted much attention. This vitamin, found in foods such as egg yolks, liver, red meat and salmon, can tune the functions of many immune cells, says Jelena Milenkovic at the University of Niš in Serbia. Around 1 billion people worldwide are deficient, including 40% of Europeans. Recent studies show how vitamin D reduces the risk of developing an autoimmune disease and can play a role in preventing respiratory infections, although no consistent effect has been found on mortality or requirement for intensive care due to COVID-19. Antioxidants are another factor commonly linked with immunity. These encompass a wide range of compounds, including vitamins C and E, plus plant-based polyphenols such as flavonoids that can neutralize highly reactive molecules called free radicals. These metabolic products can wreak havoc on our tissues by causing oxidative stress, contributing to disease and aging. Although this neutralizing power has been demonstrated in numerous lab tests, the health impacts of dietary antioxidants in real-world studies haven't lived up to their promise. One explanation is that each dietary antioxidant molecule can only neutralize one free radical, whereas the body produces antioxidant enzymes, and each of these can neutralize thousands of them. The effect of dietary antioxidants inside the cell is trivial compared with antioxidant enzymes, says Henry J. Foreman at the University of California, Merced. This could be a reason why the spice turmeric, one of the world's most revered immunity foods, and its active ingredient curcumin, an antioxidant, show inconsistent clinical effects in human trials. These findings pose a puzzle. While it appears that individual products containing high doses of vitamins and antioxidants are unlikely to deliver a health boost, diets rich in these nutrients are linked to healthier immune function. The Mediterranean diet, for instance, replete with antioxidant and vitamin-rich cereals, fruits, legumes, nuts, olive oil and vegetables, dampens down harmful inflammation, whereas the so-called Western diet, rich in sugars and saturated fats and low in complex carbohydrates, fiber and vegetables, seems to be recognized by the immune system as a threat and is linked with inflammation. For example, a 2016 trial of 25 adults compared the immune response of a typical Mediterranean meal with a Western-style one, pasta, salad, nuts and olive oil, versus a burger and fries. The fast food meal led to elevated inflammation and oxidative stress in participants, whereas the Mediterranean one dampened these responses. A number of factors could explain these effects. One is that the Mediterranean diet is rich in omega-3, a type of healthy fat found in dairy, fish, nuts, plant oils, seafood and seeds, and contains less omega-6 than a typical Western diet. This ratio of omega-3 and 6 is associated with lower inflammation, but in Western diets, the ratio is usually flipped, says Francisco Pérez Cano at the University of Barcelona in Spain. Another factor is the way that many Western-type meals are prepared. Broiling, frying, or roasting processed meat causes sugars to react with proteins, forming byproducts that trigger inflammation. At the heart of these immune effects is our microbiome, the vast bacterial community that resides in our gut. These communities of bacteria form a delicate ecosystem, says Fiona Powery at the University of Oxford. The intricate details of the interaction between the microbiome and immunity were revealed in a 2020 study of more than 2,000 people by a team of researchers led by João Xavier at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York. This showed how the abundance of different types of immune cells in the blood changed in relation to the presence of different bacterial strains in the gut. For example, a relatively high abundance of the bacterium Ruminococcus 2 was associated with increased neutrophil levels. So by virtue of the close interactions between gut immune cells and the trillions of microbes living among them, foods that affect these bacteria may have knock-on effects on our defenses. The foods we choose to eat impact our gut ecology, says Powery. Many modern diets are totally different from the ones humans evolved with over thousands of years. On evolutionary timescales, we've changed our microbiome in the blink of an eye, says Justin Sonnenberg at Stanford University in California. He believes the increasingly common inflammatory diseases of the modern world, including diabetes, atherosclerosis and inflammatory bowel disease, may be partly caused by damage to our gut microbiome from consuming a high-fat, low-fiber diet. One 2015 study, for instance, measured the effects on the microbiome when the typical high-fiber, low-fat diet of 20 rural South African people and low-fiber, high-fat meals of 20 African-American people were switched. Within 2 weeks, a profound change in the participants' microbiomes was observed, with the Western-style food associated with inflammation of the gut's mucus lining, a risk factor for the development of colon cancer. This is one of a number of studies showing how high-fiber foods such as vegetables, whole grains and legumes are key for an immune-healthy microbiome. For instance, the products of fiber fermentation by gut bacteria, short-chain fatty acids or SCFAs, such as butyrate and acetate, are anti-inflammatory. We can't digest fiber into these compounds ourselves, and eating meals rich in fibers helps to support bacterial populations that can, says Pérez Cano. This takes us back to the question of whether dietary interventions could help tip our immune system in a healthier direction. To find out, Sonnenberg and his team set up a clinical trial to investigate whether microbiome-targeting diets could modulate the immune system. For this, 39 participants were randomly assigned to a high-fiber diet, adding at least 20 grams of fiber per day to their normal meals, or a diet high in fermented foods, with 6 servings per day of kimchi, kombucha, yogurt, or fermented dairy products. Immune markers such as cytokine levels were monitored, along with the diversity and functioning of gut bacteria. This study, published last year, found that those consuming fermented foods developed more diverse microbiomes and decreased markers of inflammation. A different pattern was seen in the high-fiber cohort. Although the diversity of their gut microbiome didn't increase, it was better able to produce SCFAs. Interestingly, the immune response of the participants on a high-fiber diet varied according to the initial diversity of their gut microbes, highlighting the need for a personalized approach for any microbiome interventions. Another 2021 study, this time of nearly 1,000 participants in the UK-based Predict1 nutritional research programme, found that lower levels of markers of chronic inflammation were linked to a high habitual intake of vegetables, but not fruit. The exact mechanisms of how different species of gut bacteria affect immunity are being elucidated too. Beneficial microbes such as bifidobacterium, for example, influence immune cells via signals like the SCFAs that they produce. These compounds bind to receptors on immune cells and prompt them to produce cytokines that favour immune restraint over reactivity. We're now realising that the beneficial effects of antioxidants also seem to be due to the microbiome. Plant-based foods are rich in polyphenols that were initially thought to dampen inflammation through antioxidant activity. New research, however, suggests that these compounds influence our immune system by favouring the growth of some bacteria over others. For instance, trials in humans showed that consumption of red wine and blueberries, both rich in polyphenols, resulted in an increase in bifidobacterium. What about shortcutting this process and ingesting the right kind of bacteria for healthy gut function? This idea has fueled a boom in probiotic supplements, drinks containing live bacteria to fortify our gut microbiome. But just as with vitamin supplements, the efficacy of these products is under question. The adult gut microbiome is resilient to changes and often prevents probiotic strains from becoming resident in the gut, says Pharohs. What does all this mean for when you're in the supermarket faced with an array of supposedly immune-boosting products? To keep our natural defences in good shape, what really seems to matter is a healthy gut microbiome. For this, the most important factor is the nature of your overall diet. We can try to improve our diets by increasing our intake of fibre and fermented foods to support our microbial populations, says Sonnenberg. A 2018 study from the American Gut Citizen Science Research Program found that for maximum gut microbiome diversity, we should be eating more than 30 different types of plant a week. Although a turmeric and beetroot wellness shot or a kombucha fermented tea drink contains the kind of ingredients linked to a healthier microbiome, this isn't going to move the dial if you live mostly on burgers and fries. And watch out for products boasting their immune support potential when they're really just an unhealthy snack with a few added vitamins. But most of all, remember to nurture the cultures within your gut. They may be key to keeping your immune system in perfect balance.
On whether tiny ancient Egyptian handprints were made by reptiles. Feedback ponders a study of stenciled outlines of hands found on rocks in southwest Egypt and their owners, while also digging into the possibly misplaced assumption that accounting is boring.
Reptiles in ancient Egypt. Did prehistoric people consider themselves as equals or unequals? Asks a publication from 2020. The question is broader than it may appear. An earlier study by the same scientist suggests that some of those people weren't people. It suggests they were reptiles. Archaeologist Emmanuel Honoré at the Free University of Brussels in Belgium studied ancient drawings and paintings found on rocks in southwest Egypt. About 900 of those looked like stenciled outlines of hands, but in a report from 2016, Honoré and her colleagues noted that 13 of the hands are quite tiny. The report, First Identification of Non-Human Stencil Hands at Wadi Sura II, Egypt, a morphometric study for new insights into rock art symbolism, was published in the Journal of Archaeological Science Reports. It says tiny hands have previously been considered to belong to human babies. We challenge this identification. Evidence suggests that the hand stencils belong to an animal, most probably a reptile. The researchers reached their conclusion by measuring the tiny hand drawings and comparing them with the measurements of hands of living preterm babies. The tiny hands, they decided, are probably made by tracing the feet of young lizards or crocodiles. Honoré's latest study sidesteps the earlier reptiles or humans question. Its arguments taken on the one hand, on the other hand approach to the equals or unequals issue, and make use only of the larger, evidently human stencil-drawn hands, not the tiny, maybe reptile extremities or paws or whatever. The study's final sentence urges further research, bearing in mind that different kinds of archaeological evidence can also be in contradiction.
The joys of accounting. Almost by tradition, people assume that accounting is boring and that accountants are too. Those assumptions may be very wrong. Consider the essay titled, "Is Accounting Becoming Too Interesting?", which Geoffrey Whittington at the University of Cambridge presented as a lecture in 1995. So intense was the provocation that the paper has since been cited in more than 20 publications, an average of around 1 citation per year. Others in the profession argue that accounting and accountants aren't boring enough, and that there is too much flocky-knocky nihilipification. What is this? The answer is plain to anyone who reads the study Flocky-Knocky Nihilipification in Accounting, Does It Matter? By Raymond Chambers at the University of Sydney, published in the Australian Accounting Review in 1996 on the heels of Whittington's thunderation. Chambers explained, Flocky-Knocky Nihilipification is the habit of treating things as trivial, as of no account. Treating significant differences between things as of no account is the source of much that is confusing, vacuous, and fruitless in accounting debate. Chambers identified 3 great solecisms that had crept into the professional ways of too many accountants. He thundered, "The third solecism proceeds from the blunders of the first 2. It is the fallacy of what Whitehead has called misplaced concreteness." Chambers doesn't identify who Whitehead is or was. But too much thunder can scare off the young'uns. Ingrid Jekyll at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland analysed the ways big accountancy firms try to attract new hires. They use recruiting tricks designed to camouflage the spectre of the stereotype. For details, see her study Beyond the Boring Grey, the construction of the colourful accountant.
On boredom. Just from their titles, decide whether you want to read these 2 studies published in the British Journal of Educational Psychology. Boredom Begets Boredom, an experience sampling study on the impact of teacher boredom on student boredom and motivation. And Whatever will bore, the mere anticipation of boredom exacerbates its occurrence in lectures. After you calm down, decide whether to read this 3rd paper from the 2018 annual meeting of the American Educational Research Association, Only Boring Students Get Bored? A New Perspective on Academic Boredom. If you knee-jerkily decided no to that one, maybe this will change your mind. Here is the final sentence of that paper's abstract. Overall, recent findings on academic boredom suggest that it is a considerably more complex emotional experience than stereotypically perceived in terms of it being not only highly variable, domain-specific, and situationally dependent, but also consisting of multiple boredoms that vary in both valence and arousal. The last word on this is a study called A Theory-Based Psychoeducational Video Designed to Increase Knowledge About Boredom by researchers at the University of Alberta and the University of Manitoba in Canada. It is short, 1 page. The researchers give a clear description of what they did. We tested changes in students' knowledge about boredom pre- and post-video. Then comes a clear description of what they found. Our results showed students indicated more knowledge about boredom post-session. That sentence can be read in 2 ways.